in the United States Marine Corps in 1970. After serving in an infantry company with the 2nd Marine Division at Camp LtGen, and I have been told that LtGen is now LtGen. It's now the correct pronunciation. With me, it's never correct. He was discharged as a sergeant in 1972. He was commissioned as an officer 4 years later after graduating from the University of Massachusetts in 1976. A passionate spokesman for our troops' service and sacrifice during the global war on terrorism, Lieutenant General Kelly was previously the commanding officer, 1 Marine Expeditionary Force Forward. The command deployed to Iraq in early 2008 for a year-long mission. He also commanded Marine Force Reserve and Marine Force North from October 2009 to March 2011. He assumed his current position as the Senior Military Assistant to the Secretary of Defense in March of 2011. Ladies and gentlemen, please extend a warm welcome to Lieutenant General John F. Kelly.
Well, thanks very much, Commander. I want to open by saying certainly how privileged I am to be here today and speak to the American Legion. Both of my boys, by the way, were Boy State products from the American Legion. I can remember how proud they were of that. In fact, virtually every time I speak or go to an event like this, someone will come up and ask me if my father was a general. I don't know why they draw that conclusion. I tell them that my father, this story very quickly, I tell them that my father worked 2 jobs all his life after World War II. He was a postman and he worked for the railroad. He was drafted in 1940 in the first peacetime draft and was stationed in Massachusetts, where he was from. And on a weekend in December, he was nearing the end of his enlistment, went home to Boston for the weekend, and took the train back down from Boston to Cape Cod, where he was stationed in the old Edwards Army base. And by the time he got back to the barracks, all of his buddies were gathered around the radio, and they were listening to the reports of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And like his buddies, I'm sure, he was in the rest of the country, he was outraged, saddened by the loss, listened to the radio for a little while, and then went in to see his first sergeant, who was apparently somewhere from the South. Now, if you're from Massachusetts, that could be Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York. But he went to his first sergeant, and he's about 3 months from his discharge, having been drafted, and he said, "First Sergeant, this attack on Pearl Harbor doesn't get in the way of my discharge, does it?" And the first sergeant said, I guess in a southern accent my father would always try to mimic, "Kelly, have you ever heard the word duration?" And off to the South Pacific he went for 5 years and never came home. I guess it did affect. Again, very privileged to be here today. Your commander asked me to cover a few topics, perhaps to make some comments about the war, certainly about the threats against America, and certainly about the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and their families that serve our country. Everyone in this room, of course, knows how this war came to us about a decade ago, when 19 terrorists flew airplanes into the Pentagon, into the buildings, the trade towers up in New York, and killed 3,000 of our countrymen. All of them were innocent. All of them were undeserved of such a death. Since then, we've had many, many tangible successes against our enemies due to the FBI, the CIA, other intelligence agencies, and mostly the U.S. military. We've got him back on his heels. He's gone to ground. He's seeking other safe havens to include Somalia, Yemen, North Africa, Europe, and even the United States. He's become harder to detect because he's become decentralized and consequently harder to kill. But he can't hide from us. Our problem is we need to be 100% effective against him every day. He only has to occasionally be successful. There's other threats against us, of course. There's countries all over the globe that want to that wish us ill. Many of them want to become nuclear capable and ballistic missile capable. Some of them already are. Finally, there are state and non-state actors who are desperately every day trying to acquire nuclear and biological weapons for God knows what purpose. We didn't start this fight. It came to us motivated by a visceral loathing of everything we are. It will not end until our adversaries and their allies around the world, state and non-state alike, understand that we will never lose our faith or our courage as a people. Our enemy is savage, offers absolutely no quarter, has a single focus, and that is to either kill every one of us here at home or enslave us with a sick form of extremism that serves no God or no purpose that any decent man or woman could ever understand. I don't know why they hate us, and I don't care. But we are America, and we must prevail because we remain mankind's best hope for the future, not them. To him, this is not about our friendship with Israel, or about oil, or about empire or resources, or jobs or economic opportunity in the Middle East. It's about us as a people, about our freedoms and the way we worship our God. It is about the value and dignity we place on human life and our intense belief in the inherent value of every man, every woman, every child, in their equality in the eyes of God and under the law. It's about how we live our lives and raise our children in the privacy of our own homes. It's about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. You know the words. As Americans, we hold these truths to be self-evident. We know them in our hearts and in our souls. Our enemies do not. We cherish what our ancestors worked for, fought for, and sometimes died to give us. He loathes who we are. These are irreconcilable positions. There is no compromise. Although we remain in a life and death struggle against an evil so intolerant, it's hard for you to imagine unless you've seen it as many of us have up close. America as a whole today is certainly not at war, not as a country, not as a people. Only a tiny fraction of American families fear all day and every day a knock at the door that will shatter their lives. They bear this faith and sacrifice with grace and honor, and they carry it for the rest of the nation. It is their sons and their daughters who serve, who continue to believe in this country enough to put their lives in harm's way without thought of personal gain. They willingly pay in full the bill that comes with being free, not only for themselves, but for our country and the entire world. A friend of mine wrote me a couple of years ago on the topic. He said to us, to quote him, "Service to and sacrifice for the nation has become a legacy affair for a relatively small number of families. This nation is blessed to have families who are willing to accept the responsibility and endure the sacrifices that sustain a way of life cherished by many, but sustained by few." While some think, however, that we've produced yet another generation of materialistic and self-absorbed young people, we can thankfully watch every day in wonderment at those who serve or have served, asking not what their country can do for them, but always and with their lives what they can do for America. And while fighting and dying for us, they have learned what every American used to know, used to hold in his or her heart, used to be taught in our schools and at their mother's knee, that the real strength of America does not come from making a religion of diversity or emphasizing the differences among us. On the contrary, they've come to a profound understanding of what our founders, our forefathers, and our foremothers understood as they built a nation that was once proudly referred to as a melting pot. In our armed forces, the ultimate, most successful institution of American diversity, service members have come to understand the simple fact that America's strength was and should be again a people stitched together by a shared sense of history, values, customs, hopes, and dreams that unite us. That there is great power in us as individuals, but even greater power in individuals who voluntarily work together and support each other. They also know that the opposite is true, that we are weakened and could lose what we have if we continue down a path of identifying as hyphenated Americans or closed cultural groups focusing what's in it for me. That in spite of the efforts of those who make their living and often fill their pockets driving wedges between Americans based on race or religion, ethnicity, our servicemen and women discover early and on their own, while looking at their comrades standing with them in the ranks, that it's not about the color on the outside, but about the character on the inside. That it's not about where on earth you were born, but only why you came to America and what you did when you got here. That it's not about the God you worship. It's not about the God you worship, if you worship any God at all, but you will respect the right of your neighbor to honor any God he or she damn well pleases. That it's not about what you as an individual can achieve, but all about achieving together as a people, as friends and neighbors, for the common good. There is an exceptionalism about America, and we should treasure who we are and why we are extraordinary. We should not be embarrassed about who we are or give excuses about what we have. Those of us who serve in the armed forces or have served in the armed forces understand to our DNA these truths. Unfortunately, so many of our countrymen and women lack an appreciation for them today. All of us need to think of ourselves first and foremost as people who should be moving forward together, helping each other, willing to take up any challenge, and only then a far distant second as to what's in it for me. Rich or poor, black, white, Asian or brown, Christian, Muslim, Sikh, or Jew, we are Americans. We should be proud of that, and we should act like it. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the terrible price some Americans home have paid in the defense of this country. So over 6,000 families have paid the fullest measure in the last 10 years. They've endured an experience that most often started with a knock on the door or a ring of the doorbell in the very early morning hours by a casualty officer who'd been sitting outside the house waiting anxiously for hours for the first lights to come on. He dreaded the mission he'd been assigned that day. He was not glad to be there, but he was privileged to be there. It's a duty that is considered sacred. It is an honor to be called to do it. The minute whoever answered the door that morning saw him standing there, they knew, before he uttered his first, they knew. After that, it varies. The first two received the word, typically would possibly go up and wake a wife up and break her heart. Others had to drive to their daughter's place of work and break her heart, tell her about a brother now gone. Then calls had to be made to other children, siblings, uncles, the rest of the family. It's hard to get through it, but they do somehow. They don't have a choice. Every experience is different, but at the end, it's all exactly the same. A family is brought to its knees in a grief that is unexpectedly physical in its impact, unbearable to the mind and agonizing to the heart. A grief that never ever goes away, not even with the passage of time. Then you wait. You have to wait patiently. There's little else you can do. As the military with precision and reverence returns their cherished loved one home to the country they served, to rest in the good earth of the America they loved. There are 24 million Americans living today. 45 million have served the colors since the beginning of the Republic. 1 million have died in its defense. All of them, but particularly the fallen, are part of a legend that, God willing, will never end, our America. The irony is that those lost in this war come out of an America that no longer seems to value commitment, self-reliance, and selfless dedication to a cause, but they did. Rather, it seems many of our countrymen today are more interested in what America can do for them than in serving the nation, protecting its people, and the principles for which it stands. But they did. Most of America's casualties today were only 9 or 10 years old on 9/11. A decade later, often to their entire family's surprise, they astonished everyone when after screwing up the courage, they marched into the room and informed all they decided to join, to serve. Most parents I've spoken to asked themselves at that moment, where the hell did that come from? I never raised her to go in the service, never thought of it. Never wanted him to go to war. No parent would ever want that. Oh my God, what if she has to go overseas? What if he is injured, killed? I know my wife and I asked that very question to ourselves twice. In every case, you can be sure their families and friends never looked at him or her again in exactly the same way, particularly if the next things out of their mouth was, and I want to be a soldier, or a Navy corpsman, or a Marine. Aside from everything else these families have endured in the weeks and months and even years since their loss, they are proud of the decision their loved one made to serve this country, of their commitment, of their actions on the battlefield. Proud they stepped forward when so many others never even considered it. Proud that by this one very personal decision to serve a cause higher than themselves, regardless of the outcome to them personally, gave meaning to two questions that have over the centuries defined the dedication of free and righteous men and women in the fight against wickedness. If not me, Dad, who? If not now, Mom, when? If we do not have citizens willing to not only ask these kind of questions, but act on them, we would have lost in our struggle for independence against the oppression of the British Empire. Slavery might never have been eradicated from our shores, and the rights of all Americans under the law, I think, would still be just a dream. The Nazis would have triumphed. Death camps never liberated or eliminated, untold millions never saved from the gas chambers and the furnaces. Communism, a scourge that murdered over 100 million human beings and sucked the spirit out of billions more in its 70-year lifespan, would never have been thrown onto the dustbin of history where it always belonged. And today, the high tide of Islamic intolerance and extremism, an empire of hate that Osama bin Laden himself proclaimed would last forever, only lasted a few days after 9/11, once our country woke up and took the fight to them on their home turf. That is the kind of young person that come from the 1% of American families, as proud of their having stepped forward as they are forever sad at having lost them. The comforting news to our countrymen who have decided to sit it out and watch in amazement from the sidelines at what their soldiers, sailors, Coast Guardsmen, and Marines do every day for them in this war is that they are as good, our service people, as any who ever came before them in our history. As good as what their fathers and grandfathers did in the wars they had to fight for America. But like those who came before them, they are not born killers. Rather, they are overwhelmingly good and decent kids who, without thought of self, perform remarkable and most often unsung acts of bravery to a cause they decided is bigger and more important than they are themselves. Any one of them could have done something more self-serving, but they didn't. They chose to serve knowing full well a vicious war was in their future. They welcomed the most basic and esteemed responsibility of a citizen, the defense of country. Men and women of their spirit know no other way. They're the best of their generation, and in their unselfishness put America, with all its current divisiveness, ahead of themselves, betting on the come and the wisdom and the greatness of the American people. All of them are heroes for simply stepping forward, and our country owes a debt it can never repay. And the only reward they ask for, ironically, the only legacy they hope for, is that the nation not forget what they did. That we appreciate the very country they defended and the freedoms they fought and died for. I've known a few of them personally, but I can say without hesitation that in many ways, I knew them all very, very well. I certainly did not share in the birth or the joy of their birth. I also was not at church when they were baptized or years later when they received First Holy Communion, confirmation, or were married. I wasn't there for their first day of school or their first job or their first date or prom or their graduation from high school or college. In some respects, however, I knew them better than their families, because in 10,000 conversations over the years as both an officer and an NCO, in peacetime and war, I was privileged and touched when they talked to me about their parents and the families they loved and missed so much, about their favorite uncle who kicked them in the ass when they needed it, or a respected grandparent who lived with them, about the older brother that took care of them and showed them how to use a pocket knife, or a kid sister they worshiped and looked out for every day on the way home from school, about the hometowns they could not wait to get back to someday, about the girl they wanted to marry or already had, and how they wanted a family of their own and kids that would look up to them as they did their folks. The biggest difference, however, in the way I knew them was I was with them in combat. I've seen them literally turn the intangibles of commitment, bravery, and selfless devotion into real and meaningful action. In my 3 tours in this war, I never saw one hesitate or do anything other than lean into the fire and, with no apparent fear of death or injury, take the fight to those who would do you harm. Day after day, I witnessed them without hesitation climb into the trucks or helicopters or depart the wire on foot patrol and do it as if they were born to it. We're indestructible. We're without fear. They learn early, however, as anyone who's truly experienced combat does, that fear is always with you. They also know firsthand how random combat is, how you have absolutely no control over whether you live or die. What can happen to you or your best friend, one of your men, your squad leader, your lieutenant, what can happen in an instant. But they still go. Many see it up close and very personal every day. It's frightening, it's horrible, but still they go. The fear is at times all-consuming, but that's what courage is, I think, pushing through the dread and going to do one's duty regardless of the danger. Their parents likely never saw that side of them growing up, but I saw it every day. Their families likely did not know them as one of the bravest, most courageous, and committed young people our society produces. But I can attest to it personally. As terrifying as combat is when it starts, when the explosions and traces are everywhere, and there's no rational reason on this earth for a man or a woman to do anything but run away in horror or find a hole to hide in and pray to God to make it stop. They don't. When no one would call them coward for cowering behind a wall or shivering in panic in a bunker, slave to the most basic of all instincts, survival, none of them do. When the calls for the corpsman or medic are shouted from the mouths of young kids who know they will soon be with their God. When seconds seem like hours and it all becomes slow motion and fast forward at the same time, and the only sensible act is to stop, get down, save yourself. They never did. It doesn't matter if it's a gunfight, an IED, a suicide bomb, a mortar, a rocket attack, or all of it all at once. They are simply magnificent. And the parents and the loved ones of those who will never come home can take comfort in the fact that when they fell, they were not alone. When they went, they were surrounded by the finest men and women on this earth, their buddies, who desperately tried to save their lives while holding their hands and staring into their eyes, praying with them, listening to the little stories about their hometowns or their families until they were gone. They were not alone. And when the Spirit left them and God, and in His infinite wisdom, took them to His bosom, their military family lovingly wrapped them in whatever passed for a shroud and took them home. In this, their last journey, they were never alone. At every stop along the way, they were treated with the greatest respect and reverence due a fallen hero, until members of the service they proudly joined brought them back to whatever corner of America they came from. Well over 6,000 now have died, 2,000 in Afghanistan. Their families have been sentenced to a life of dealing with their loss for the rest of their own lives. Thousands more have suffered wounds since it all started, but like anyone who loses life or limb while serving others, they are not victims. Young as they are, they knew exactly what they were about and were doing exactly what they wanted to do. Those with less of a sense of service to the nation will never understand it when men and women of integrity step forward and look danger and adversity straight in the eye, refusing to blink or give ground even to their own deaths. The protected can't begin to understand the price paid so they and their families can sleep safe at night. What they are missing, however, what the protected will never understand is a sense of commitment, the sense of joy, the sense of honor serving one's country in uniform gives. In my hundreds of trips to military hospitals around the country since 2003, since the start of the war, I've visited with many hundreds of grievously wounded American kids and their families. No matter how battered they were, no matter how many arms or legs they'd lost, their families thanked God they'd come home to them alive. But they also very quietly asked, was it worth it? I never tried to answer that question. I couldn't. It wasn't one of my boys laying there. I couldn't begin to fathom the innermost thoughts of a parent who stood and watched throughout the night at the bedside of someone who they loved so much, now so terribly wounded. Who was I to offer an opinion? And in my dozens of conversations with families of the fallen at Dover, or at gravesides at Arlington, or at other gatherings, I've been similarly asked, was it worth it? Worth the life of someone so dear, who they'd brought into the world, raised and nurtured so lovingly, and so much look forward to seeing grow up, find a wonderful husband or wife, and give them grandchildren to spoil. Again, I had no right to reply, because as hard as I tried to understand what the immensity of their loss must be, and the depth of the sorrow in their heart, I knew it was impossible. My sense then was it was inconceivable for anyone to understand that has not had his own heart pierced with such sadness. I learned I was right. Before I go, I just want to relate a quick story to you. To me, it summarizes what our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines are all about, Coast Guardsmen. Happens to be about a Marine battalion, but it could be any ship at sea, any Air Force squadron, any Army unit in the fight, certainly any Marine unit. I just started working for Secretary Bob Gates. He's gone now, but I just started working for him. My first day with him, we flew to Kabul, got on a Marine C-130, flew down to Camp Leatherneck, and then got on a Marine V-22 and flew down to a very, very small forward operating base that happened to be the headquarters position of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. My son had served in 3-5 only a few months before. In September, the Marines in 2010 had just relieved the British, and by intercepts and intelligence, the Taliban immediately understood there was a new bunch of crazy men in town, as they put it. They complained to their commanders in Pakistan that they were being hunted relentlessly by these Marines, and they were losing and needed help. The Marines and the Taliban, from the day they met, decided they didn't like each other very much and fought for months like two wild animals locked in a cage. The Islamists fought and offered no quarter. The Marines fought better, and since, in their 236-year history, they'd never learned the definition of surrender. That wasn't on the table. 3-5 took it on the chin on some days. 3-5 took it on the chin on some days, but they kept their honor clean and fought and won. We traveled down to 3-5, Secretary Gates and I, to say thanks to that battalion that by then had lost more men killed and wounded than any other battalion in the war. By our arrival, however, they were masters of the valley. As I was to learn about Mr. Gates in subsequent visits, he always liked to address a large group, and about 100, 150 Marines were brought together, many of them from the outlying patrol bases and FOBs, every one of which in the Sangin River Valley was under siege at that time. These guys were in continuous contact, no amenities whatsoever, no internet connection, no telephones, no air conditioning, no showers, no laundry. From a distance, they smelled almost like barnyard animals. But you weren't sure until you get close to them, and then you realize it was them that actually smelled that bad. When you got close to them, you realized however, that their shaves were close and their weapons were immaculate. These were tough men, mostly in their late teens and very early 20s, but all of them nearing old age for the time they'd spent in Sangin, Afghanistan. They only needed ammunition, something to eat, and comradeship, all of which they were rich in. In any event, the Secretary then asked, after he had talked to the larger group, as he always did, to sit down with 8 or 10 junior Marines in this case. And you'd always ask them what's on their minds. And of course, at that point, they're all looking in every direction but towards him. But he picked one out that made a mistake of taking a peek and making eye contact with the Secretary of Defense. He said, "What do you do here, Marine?" After a few awkward moments, he said, the Marine, "Sir, we fight the Taliban." Another offered, looking directly at me, and sometimes they get us, sir, but most of the time we get them. And another added, "But that's all right, sir, because that's what Marines do." A few more questions, and Mr. Gates asked, "Okay, you guys, you've got the Secretary of Defense here sitting with you. This is your chance. What can I do for you?" Silence. "Come on, fellas, what can I do for you?" the Secretary said. One answered. He was maybe 19. He said, "Sir, don't let them forget what we did here. Don't let them ever forget what we did here and the friends that will never get home." God bless America, ladies and gentlemen, and to our fallen, may they rest in peace. May all of us who love them find peace and understanding in their sacrifice, that the America that they so loved and protected and gave their lives for is forever worthy of their sacrifice. Of this I pray. Semper Fidelis. Thank you.